Hey everyone, thanks for tuning into my video blog again. So in my last video blog, I talked about this idea of having stubborn faith, of really standing on what God has promised in your life and not being willing to move too far to the left or to the right. But if God has spoken something to you, that you really stand firm on that and you know that God is going to see to that promise and he's going to bring it to pass. So with my video blog this week, I sort of want to continue in this uh, discussion or topic of faith and really holding true to what God has promised to you. And I think sometimes it's so easy for us to forget what God has promised to us. It's easy for us when we get overwhelmed with our situations and our circumstances. We forget sometimes that God has promised us something way in the beginning. And when we get to that difficult spot, we forget that thing that God told us would happen eventually. And so that's sort of what I want to talk about in my video blog today. And I want to talk about Abraham. This is a person who his faith was tested many, many, many times. And throughout it all, Abraham was obedient and he trusted God and he went with faith and he did things even though sometimes they didn't make sense. He didn't understand or he didn't know, but he knew that if God promised him something, that he didn't forget that promise. He held on to that promise, and that's what helped him to make a lot of difficult decisions. And so today I want to talk about arguably one of Abraham's most difficult test that he had to face. In the book of Genesis, chapter 22, God was testing his faith, and he told Abraham to sacrifice his only son. And so, if you can imagine, for all of you who are parents, if someone told you that you had to literally sacrifice your son, and this was something that happened in the Old Testament, it was something that people did as a ritual. They would sacrifice lambs or goats and different animals, and they would literally kill these animals and offer them as an offering. And so, God was testing Abraham's faith, and he told him that he was to offer his only son as an offering. So you can only imagine how Abraham may have felt about this. And so I'm just going to read one passage of scripture in Genesis chapter 22. And it says, "Sometime later, God tested Abraham's faith. 'Abraham,' God called. 'Yes,' he replied, 'here I am.' In verse 2 it says, 'Take your son, your only son, yes, Isaac, whom you love so much, and go to the land of Moriah. Go and sacrifice him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I will show you.'" So we see here that, number one, God was testing Abraham's faith, and he wanted him to offer his only son in whom he loved. Now, it's important to first understand that in the previous chapters, God had promised, he gave Abraham a promise, and he told him that the nations were going to be blessed through his body. He told him that, through one of his descendants, that the world will be blessed, and that many, many blessings and good things will come from Abraham. And so now Abraham is being asked to offer his only son, the only possibility that through him the nations could be blessed, because he had no other children at this time. And so it's important to know that Abraham knew that God had already promised him that the nations will be blessed through him. So Abraham knew that, if God was asking him to sacrifice his son, either he was going to raise his son from the dead, or God would find another way to fulfill that promise. And so if you go through, I really encourage you to read Genesis chapter 22. It really doesn't say much about how Abraham was feeling or any anxiety that he was having at the time. If you look in the scriptures, Abraham, he got up early at sunrise the next morning, and he went on to do what God had told him to do, and that was to sacrifice his son. And so he got up in the morning, he did all of that. And if you go further down in the scripture, Abraham had put his son on the wood. He was ready to sacrifice his son. And his son asked him, when he got up there, he said, "Where is the offering?" His son was kind of like, "Are you going to put me on there? Is this really about to happen?" And in verse 8, the scripture says, "God will provide a sheep for the burnt offering, my son," Abraham answered, and they both walked on together. When they arrived at the place where God had told him to go, Abraham built an altar and arranged the wood on it. Then he tied his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham picked up the knife to kill his son as a sacrifice. At that moment, the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Yes, Abraham replied, here I am. Don't lay a hand on the boy, the angel said. Do not hurt him in any way. For now I know that you truly fear God. You have not withheld from me even your son, your only son. Then Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught by its horns in a thicket. So he took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering in place of his son. Abraham named the place Jehovah-Jireh, which means the Lord will provide. To this day, people still use that name as a proverb. On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. So we see this whole story happening, that first of all, Abraham was given a promise before we got to this point that through him the nations will be blessed. And this was going to happen through his son. So when he received these directions from God to sacrifice his son, Abraham really knew and he remembered that promise and he did not forget. And that's why it's so important for us to remember what God has promised us, because when we hit those very difficult moments like Abraham did, we have to go back to that promise and realize, if God said that this is going to happen, it will happen, and I have to trust that God will do it some way, somehow. And that's exactly what Abraham did with his faith. He told his son, God's going to provide a lamb. And God did exactly that. And that's why we have the common saying of Jehovah-Jireh. And that comes from this story of the Lord will provide, because the Lord did just that. He provided a ram in the place of his son. But it was important that Abraham showed his faith. He was obedient to what God told him to do. And I'm going to read in the book of Hebrews chapter 11. This is sort of, this passage that I'm going to read is sort of like the hall of faith, some people call it, where people who had great faith in the Bible, they're sort of talked about. And so I want to read verses 17 and 18. And this sort of brings everything back together and why it's so important to remember the promises that God speaks over our life, even when we come to those difficult moments. And so Hebrews 11 and verse 17, it says, it was by faith that Abraham offered Isaac as a sacrifice when God was testing him. Abraham, who had received God's promises, was ready to sacrifice his only son, Isaac, even though God had told him, Isaac is the son through whom your descendants will be counted. Abraham reasoned that if Isaac died, God was able to bring him back to life again. And in a sense, Abraham did receive his son back from the dead. So the thing that really stands out there is that Abraham reasoned with his faith, with the promise that God had given him. He did not forget that. And so that's the point that I really, really want to drive in my video blog today, is that you cannot forget the promises, the things that God has done for you in the past, the other times that he has delivered you, has healed you, provided for you when you didn't think there was any way out. And so it's so important for us to remember those promises, because it helps us get through those difficult times. And right now I find myself in some very difficult and challenging situations, and holding true to those instructions that God gave me to move back home and to really start a work and a life here. And right now I'm not seeing those promises come to pass, but I have to remember that God instructed me to do this. I did it by obedience and by faith, and I have to really know and trust that God is going to do exactly what he said he would do. It may not seem like it right now, but just like that scripture says, when it's talking about Jehovah-Jireh, the Lord will provide and the Lord will see to it. If he has given you a promise, God is going to do it. And it may not look how we want it to look, and it may not come in the time that we want, but we have to know that God will provide and he will be true to his word. So we can't forget God's promises. We can't have amnesia where sometimes we forget the things that God has done in the past for us and how he's provided and delivered us. God will do it again. You just have to be obedient and you have to follow after God. And I guarantee you, you will see that promise come to pass.